So, welcome everybody to the Clements Library Bookworm. This is our 14th episode. I'm Angela Unk, Director of Development at the Clements Library. I just want to remind you that today's meeting is being recorded to share online, and we will also send you an email follow-up with a link to the recording later this afternoon. Just a quick tutorial. I see people are finding the chat function, so please continue to chime in there. We love to have a conversation with our attendees. Select all panelists and attendees so that everyone can see it. And you'll note though that the conversation goes by very quickly. So if you do have a specific question today for Scott and Jane, please be sure to put that in the Q&A section. You'll also notice in the Q&A section that you can upvote, i.e. thumbs up questions so that they move to the top. And if you have comments or answers to questions, you can go ahead and comment on those questions as well, and it'll be saved right there with the question. We have a poll today. For those of you who signed on early, we've been talking about the acknowledgement section in a book. So while I'm finishing up, you can go ahead and take that poll as well. Oh, and I didn't say, Anne and Tracy will be monitoring the chat and helping out, so you'll see them in there today. This program is brought to you by the William L. Clements Library on the campus of the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor. The Clements Library enables the discovery, learning, and teaching of American history through the collection, conservation, digitization, and availability of primary sources on paper. And one of the reasons that we started this program and envisioned it the way we did is we started to think about Clements Library Tea Time when we invite the researchers to gather around our tea table and have a conversation about their work. And Scott, I know that you've researched at the Clements Library. Do you have any comments about tea time?
Yeah, I mean, I loved it. I mean, it was so important for me. Actually, both times I was at the Clements researching, I happened by pure coincidence to overlap with the same professor, Dr. Greg Irwin from Temple University, who's just a world-class military historian. And we would wait outside of the library together to get in every morning for 5 or 6 minutes, and then we would do the tea time. And, you know, you just build a real rapport. And it was one place where I would, as a graduate student, and he's, you know, this full professor, right? I would have all these questions and be so confused. And it was a site of just really important mentorship, right? And it just really epitomizes how, you know, the archives and the materials you preserve and catalog and provide access to is, of course, fundamental to your mission. But the sort of conversations that come up around all of those things are also really fundamental to your, like, I just simply would not have written chapter 2 the way I did without a lot of that. So, you know, those two things just work hand in hand really well at the Clements.
Thank you. Thanks so much. Today's episode is generously sponsored by Fishman Stewart PLLC, and we thank them very much for this, and we're happy to be able to continue the bookworm. I'm going to go ahead, click quick if you want to vote in the poll. I'm going to end the polling. So you'll be happy to know half of the people do indeed read the acknowledgement section, and many people do say sometimes. So I think that's a good sign. And after the conversation we had before this program started, I'll never skip it again. All right. So I'm really happy to welcome Jane Polemy back to the bookworm today. Jane is the assistant curator of manuscripts at the Clements Library and will be hosting a conversation with 2011 Prize Fellow Scott Heerman. Jane received her BA from Albion College in 2006 with a major in history and a concentration in ethnic studies. In 2013, she graduated from Yale University with a dual PhD in history and African American studies. Thanks for being here today, Jane. And I'll turn it over to you to introduce Scott and to continue the conversation.
Great. So let me just start by saying it is such a pure delight to be here today talking with you, Scott. I often work in the reading room. I work with fellows, I pull materials, I'm there for tea time. So I see those early processes of you guys like grappling with the sources. But now to be able to talk to you once the book is published is kind of a rare delight to kind of see how that comes to fruition. So thank you for joining us today. So Dr. Scott Heerman is an assistant professor of history at the University of Miami. He is the author of the book we'll be discussing today, The Alchemy of Slavery, Human Bondage and Emancipation in the Illinois Country, 1730 to 1865. He is also the author of 7 articles and book chapters, and he's held an impressive list of fellowships, including from the Huntington Library, the National Endowment of the Humanities, the Library Company of Philadelphia, the Filson Historical Society, the Abraham Lincoln Library and Museum, the Newberry Library, and of course, most relevant and close to our hearts today, he was a Price Fellow here at the Clements in 2011. So thank you for joining us. And before we get too far away from the acknowledgements discussion, I just wanted to say that one of the highlights of the book for me was reading your acknowledgement section where you take a small moment to say that each citation is a small thank you, and that just made my heart glow. So could you maybe just start us off by talking a little bit about what you meant by that?
Yeah, I mean, writing a book is such a profoundly collaborative process. And it's that I did not understand before, and I'm only still coming to terms with now that I'm writing a second book. And it's almost impossible to adequately thank in the appropriate depth all of the people that shape how you write a book. And so one example that comes from the Clements was this source I found, the Israel Shreve's diary. And it's this account of this traveler coming, here we have an image of it, coming up and down the Mississippi River Valley, in and out of Illinois, the area that I'm writing about in the late 18th century. And he encounters enslaved people being shipped across the Ohio, and he writes about it. And it's in fact one of the first travel accounts we have that mentions enslaved people. It's a really interesting and important source. It comes up very prominently in chapter 3. And I found it because when I was there and I talked to someone on the first day, they said, oh, this is the diary you need. The Clements, I think, had just acquired it, and it wasn't fully cataloged yet. So would I have found this diary after a month on my own? I hope so. I'm going to tell myself yes. Was it a lot easier because someone such as yourself has just deep and profound knowledge of your collections? Yes. And something like this has happened at every repository I have ever been to. I tell one of the bibliographic scholars, either a collections or a bibliographer or whomever, this is what I'm working on, and they say, oh, there's this one random pamphlet you should go look at, and it ends up being fundamental. And just those sorts of research finds are what I'm trying to acknowledge there.
Wow, it's much appreciated, and I thought that was just a beautiful turn of phrase, and I think that will change how I read footnotes from here forward. So I'm really excited today to just kind of learn more about your book and have the chance to share that with the audience, kind of talk about your sources and the insights that it provides. So just to kind of kick us off, would you mind just giving us a brief synopsis of the book for those that haven't had a chance to pick it up yet?
Sure. So as the subtitle of the book suggests, it's a study of slavery and freedom in the upper Mississippi River Valley, what eventually becomes the state of Illinois. And what I try to do with this study in some ways is to turn the story of slavery and freedom in America inside out, right? That traditionally we think about the history of slavery as moving from east to west, right? That a transatlantic slave trade brought African captives to the shore of North America. And then by the 19th century, a great plantation complex metastasized across the Deep South, perpetuating Indian removal and creating cotton country, right? So the story of slavery and freedom moves sort of from east to west. I begin the story of slavery in the heart of North America and then trace its connections out to the wider nation. Because I think implicit in the other model is an idea that slavery is a colonial imposition on North America, right? That Europeans brought it. In fact, native nations enslaved and were enslaved each other for centuries before and centuries after European contact. So by foregrounding sort of the experiences in the heart of North America, we just get a very different picture of how slavery came into being in North America, and then ultimately a very different picture of how abolition plays out, right? So the sort of one sentence of the book in some ways is this is a story where slavery isn't an institution and abolition isn't a movement.
I mean, it's an incredible story, and you kind of by being grounded in one place can kind of show the nuances and change over time and how kind of slavery evolves from one thing to another again and again and again. And you cover a huge amount of time in a kind of an impressively concise way. So like kudos, it was really impressive. Just calling you out for that. But that's like really hard to write and research. And so I'm curious if you could tell us kind of what inspired you or gave you the courage to take on this like really challenging topic.
Yeah, so the project began as an 18th century study of sort of many slaveries of North America, right? Slavery in native North America, and then slavery in French, Spanish, British, and ultimately US empires, right? Because as you know, scholars know, and is sort of obvious to many of us, different nations and different empires are going to treat slavery differently, right? It depends if you're a Catholic or a Protestant empire. It depends if you're a continental or maritime empire, right? I mean, there's just all sorts of different ways that shape slavery. But rather than telling a sort of comparative story where we have A and B and how are they similar, I wanted to tell a more entangled story, where look at places where multiple empires joust over land and bring slavery in, and how that might change. So, you know, in some ways, the first title of the book was Many Slaveries. And then it was going to end about 1800 when slavery ended in Illinois, I thought, right? And the problem that I ran into was I couldn't end the book, right? I kept like going up to where I know the story had to end, and I couldn't end it because I kept finding all of these sources and said, no, you've got to keep going. And that then really transformed the project to go as long as it did. And there are really two moments that made me realize I had to do this. The first was at Illinois' statehood in 1818. A man who was a senator and governor of Illinois was giving this, you know, address on slavery. And he's talking about the 7 Years' War, right? And I think, well, what does Illinois' admission in 1818 have anything to do with the 7 Years' War, right? That's just not a connection I had thought of. And then another episode that plays out in the 1840s is people like Richard Yates or Abraham Lincoln or Lyman Trumbull, leaders of the Republican Party in the sort of big freedom national movement, are reckoning with groups of people called the French Negroes, a category we'll talk about some later in the book. And so that in the 1840s, you had Illinois politicians dealing with 1730s colonial legacies, made me realize that the colonial origins of this story, that is to say where colonialism existed and how those colonial experiences shaped the nation state, are just bigger and broader than I had appreciated. So that sort of led to the somewhat Frankenstein book that we have now.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting to hear and important to remember, like a book is a process, you know, like you come in with one research question and then the sources kind of lead you and it raises different questions and brings you in an entirely different direction. So thank you for kind of sharing that story with us. Which brings me to my next question, which is the title. Like, I know I always like leave the title for last, and it's always something really, really bad until someone more poetic than me comes up with something a little bit more poignant. But could you talk us through how you chose your title and how maybe it changed from the Many Slaveries to the Alchemy of Slavery, and kind of what the power of that term is and why you chose it?
Sure. So part of the issue was there actually aren't many slaveries in Illinois. I argue it's a sort of ever adaptive institution, right? Mm-hmm. And so when I realized that my argument had to change, I realized the title's completely wrong. And when I was a fellow at the Huntington Library, they took all of us to the Getty Museum in Los Angeles, and we saw an exhibit on alchemy. Another example of how all of the sort of fellow interactions and collaborations at institutions is incredibly intellectually important, just like tea time at the Clements. And when I was there, I sort of thought, actually, in a weird way, this is what I'm talking about. A power that is difficult to explain, a power that is difficult to pin down, a process that's really sort of surprising and unexpected, is how, in some ways, slavery existed so long in Illinois, right? Because it's a story, I argue, of changing one type of unfree person into another type, right? So captive Indians, right, become enslaved people who work on plantations. Enslaved people of African descent and of indigenous descent together become French Negroes, a completely invented category because these people were neither French nor of African descent, right? Many of those French Negroes, in turn, in the 19th century, become lifelong uncompensated servants, right? Many of those servants and enslaved people will turn themselves into formerly enslaved people, into freed men and women. And then on the eve of Civil War, when the kidnapping of African Americans is taking off, free people are again turned into kidnapped captives and trafficked down the Mississippi River Valley. So it's the transformation of a captive into a slave, of two different types of slaves into the same type of slaves into servants, servants into freed people into captives. It's that sort of fiendishly adaptable power relationship that is enslavement that I try to get at with this phrase, the alchemy of slavery.
I mean, it's just an incredibly powerful framework, and I really appreciated how you allow that for like to be like a series of choices that's happening on the ground. It's not like just taken for granted that like this is just what slavery was. Like no, like slavery is constantly reinvented. It's constantly being negotiated. It's like a, you know, like every single day, every single choice is how slavery continues to exist. I think that was such a powerful way for me to kind of shape my thinking about not only that story of Illinois, but elsewhere. So can you talk a little bit though about like what impact approaching like the history of slavery broadly as that series of power and freedom practices that are constantly reinvented and renegotiated, what kind of power that has for like the broader study of slavery versus thinking of slavery just as like an institution that exists?
Sure. So what it allows me to do is to explain just the diverse nature of enslaved people's experiences in Southern Illinois and frankly everywhere else as well. So, you know, there's this moment in the early 19th century, like 1803, 4, 5, where in one tiny town, I have an enslaved Indian woman, right, who was not born into slavery. I know she was, you know, trafficked there as part of the captive exchange system that I talk about in chapter 1. I have an African-American boy born into slavery. I have a lifelong uncompensated indentured servant, and there is a free person who gets kidnapped and dragged into Missouri, right? So how does slavery function? Which one of those people is a slave, right? And so rather than having a conversation about like, the real slavery and then proto-slavery and quasi-slavery and all of these other modifiers you see, I just decided to drop the idea that slavery had to be an institution, right? And so the institution of slavery is in fact one of the most ubiquitous phrases that we see. But I think it conceals a lot, right? It conceals that slavery functioned differently at different times and places. And it also sort of requires us to take an approach to the history of slavery that foregrounds local power struggles, right? I think all too often when we write about big issues about slavery and freedom, we write at the macro level, wars and treaties and laws and amendments, right? And those of course are important, but I don't think we should locate change there. I think change has to be located at the local level, where would-be enslavers and would-be freed people bitterly locked together are looking for what resources they can recruit, right? Can they conscript the courts to their sides or not? Can they rely on civic institutions or not? Can they recruit money and financing and capital and technology or not, right? When we begin to ask those questions, we set aside the idea that slavery is an institution, right? And we begin to look at the sort of multifaceted ways enslavers had to create this power relationship and enslaved people could push back against it.
Yeah, and I really appreciated like that approach allowed for those personal stories to come out, you know, that, you know, you can name enslavers as complicit, like you were making that choice, you were doing these practices, and you were also able to foreground the stories that you were able to find of the people who were enslaved, like, and to like name them and their experience, and to like bring that to the foreground. Like that was it's really powerful to be able to allow that agency, both for the enslaver and the enslaved, to say like that's all part of the story. It's not just something that happened to you, it's something that you did. And I think that was really, really important. And it really resonated with me reading your book at the moment when the Black Lives Matter protests and marches were happening, when people are calling us out to say their names. Like it really resonated reading that story at the same time that I'm still thinking about, you know, the ways that structural racism happens, you know, the disproportionate impact of coronavirus on communities of color, you know, that how that alchemy of slavery is, you know, is it really the story of the wily nature of white supremacy that continues to happen in today's environment. So could you talk a little bit about like whether we can carry that framework about like the, you know, the adaptability of white power like into our present moment?
Sure, absolutely. I mean, I have to confess, I don't have the answer to that. And I think that's precisely why we should be talking about it, right? I mean, we should be here asking questions that don't have easy answers. You know, what I would say though, or my own perspective on this is, if we think of slavery as no longer as an institution, then we have to think of the abolition movement very differently, right? That an institution can be abolished, right? Think of, you know, the Michigan football team, for example. You could abolish it, and depending how they're playing any fall, some people might be fine with that. But football, you probably can't abolish, right? Because there's going to be a park somewhere and people are going to do this, right? I mean, and so when we think of slavery not as a sort of fixed institution, but as the sort of broader set of practices, it means there's not a time and place when we can sort of say slavery is over, right? Mm-hmm. It takes the finality away from the abolition moment and movement, and it expands it into much broader terrains. I also think one of the things that my book tries to do, both explicitly and implicitly, is expand the history of slavery into more places, more geographies, and more areas of American life, right? We have a real tendency in the United States to contain the history of slavery. Slavery was a Southern thing. Only a small percentage of white Southerners owned slaves. Slavery ended either in New York in 1827 or the Emancipation Proclamation of 1863 or Juneteenth, right? We find these events, these places where we say, here this institution existed, now it's over, right? And what that does is it sort of chokes off the ability to use and understand the history of slavery to inform later freedom struggles, right? If we understand that slavery wasn't ended at any particular moment or wasn't abolished by a law or a treaty or a war, then what we can do is begin to understand how the history of slavery connects to the later 19th century and then the 20th century, right? And many scholars have done just that, whether it's Michelle Alexander looking at the prison system, Ava DuVernay with her wonderful documentary, right? Many scholars have done that. But I think part of what my work is trying to do is to sort of recognize that this big rupture that we think of as emancipation wasn't that there's in fact all sorts of continuities that can exist before and after slavery that give us a more usable history for our present moment.
Yeah, I think that's it's a really powerful way to kind of frame it, and the kind of, for me, really highlighted like the impact the humanities can have, both about thinking like about a particular moment in time, but then also kind of like expanding that to these broader conversations, both whether it be about like human nature or the experience of relationships and power. Like it's I think history is at its best when it can be like both and, you know, like the particular and these bigger questions. So kind of in that same line of thinking about like the particular and the more bigger questions, I was curious reading your book about whether or not that dynamic that you track in Illinois is kind of replicated elsewhere, that also saw kind of either like multiple regime shifts, you know, thinking about like Louisiana, Florida, or was like that kind of dynamic kind of more particular just to the Illinois context?
Yeah, so I actually think my approach can be used everywhere, not just, I mean, I think everywhere. Of course, I have to think that. But certainly in the United States, because my approach is not to look at a sort of marginal slave society and say, oh, look at how this changes, right? That is, I chose this region for a set of reasons we can get into, but we can use the exact same analysis to say, okay, slavery in Louisiana or in Virginia or in South Carolina isn't an institution. It's a series of coercive practices. When and how did white people assemble the power they need to enslave people, right? When and how did enslaved people disrupt that power, right? And dismantle it, right? Those are the questions we can ask everywhere, even if slavery does approach a more institutional look and feel, say in somewhere like South Carolina. So part of this is all of the places where multiple different jurisdictions overlap, right? And if we remember that North America was sovereign native soil long before it was anything else, there's always a multiplicity of jurisdictions in any state, colony, or territory, right? Mm-hmm. I think what makes Illinois particular is that unlike Florida, unlike Louisiana, unlike East Texas, where many of these dynamics are on display, Illinois becomes nominally a free state, right? Technically, slavery is illegal in Illinois 3 different times by 3 different provisions, right? Mm-hmm. It never really quite works, and that's part of what I think through in the second half of the book. Whereas in the Deep South, there is just a headlong rush to make a plantation society, and masters, for a variety of reasons, are much more successful at building that plantation economy there. So I think what's particular about Illinois simply is that masters are doing this in spite of, or despite of, or against what laws tell them should be happening.
I also just really appreciated getting to learn about slavery in Illinois, because it's not a story that is foregrounded as much. And so I had a lot of, I did not know that moments, like reading your book, like, oh, what? You know, like we've mentioned a couple of times that concept of the French Negro, where, you know, it's an invented legal category that kind of like invokes French colonial precedents to allow people to keep enslaving people in perpetuity because they have this, like, you know, hereditary relationship to people who were enslaved under French control. And it's just, I'd never heard of that. And, you know, I had never heard of the grueling labor that enslaved people had to take in salt works. And like, it's not something I'd encountered in discussions of slavery. So it was kind of a really, it's like by grounding it in Illinois, you also like kind of highlight these moments that I think people don't always encounter. Could you maybe talk us through some of the eye-opening bits of like, I did not know that moment when you're like in the archive, and how that maybe shaped some of your thinking on the project?
Yeah, sure. I mean, there's a lot of them, but the one that really stood out for me was finding the Catholic baptismal registries in Southern Illinois. And these were documents that I wasn't really sure I needed. I was sort of there on a hunch. But these are documents kept by, you know, what is the oldest continually operating Catholic church in North America, right? Holy Family Parish was founded in 1699, and the original baptismal records are still there. And what I found is, as you go into the later periods, is all of these records of slavery, right? So here's one for this woman we see here, Cynthia Ann, dated the 26th of August, 1838. And as you can see right below Cynthia Ann, slave of Judge Pope, right? This isn't, and below we see in the account, Agnes is a slave to Judge and Pope, right? So this was one of these moments where I thought, oh, wow, slavery exists into the 1830s, and not quasi-slavery and not maybe slavery. I mean, it's here in black and white, right? But this was not only surprising to me for that reason, but it also transformed how I thought about slavery. Before I found sources like these, I thought, okay, in the 19th century, after slavery is illegal, these people are sort of crammed in basements or hidden away in attics or locked in closets, much like human trafficking is today, right? A sort of illegal form of enslavement. But if we look at this document, one, slave of Judge Pope, right? This is the local judge in Southern Illinois. And two, baptisms and baptismal documents are public ceremonies, right? There are godparents there. There are family members there. Members of the parish would certainly know this was happening. And so what it made me realize, together with accounts in newspapers and other public documents, is slavery existed not as the sort of quiet, clandestine criminal practice, but as an open, publicly acknowledged, perfectly well-known set of bound labor experiences into, here we have 1838, I have ones that go later into the 1840s. So that was sort of one of these transformations for me.
Yeah, I just want to also just applaud you. Like reading your footnotes was just really impressive. Like you reference these like baptism registries, court dockets, case files, deed books, probate records, like all of these like really dense. Like those aren't easy to go through. Like you got to do a lot of winnowing to try to find those stories and figure out what to do with them. Could you talk us through like what that process of engaging with these types of sources were and like how you manage kind of the fragmentary nature of many of the collections?
Sure. I mean, so my approach, once I realized that this project wasn't going to end in 1800 and that it was going to go much later, my approach was to begin to ask a series of questions about what sort of relationships would exist around slavery, right? And which of those relationships would create paper, right? Would create documents. So things like baptismal registries, things like bills of sale and deeds and recorded property, things like lawsuits, right? Freedom suits or property disputes over an enslaved person, right? All of those are relationships that are going to create paper. And once I could get my head around what those relationships were, then I began to ask myself where those documents might survive, right? In some ways, my research approach and sort of my thought about sources is to think of it as sort of like Russian nesting dolls, right? That we have the sort of largest doll, the sort of outside layer, and that's all the sort of social relationships that exist in the world, right? And power relationships exist in all of those, right? Some big, some small, but they're there, right? I think about the next layer then as what relationships create paper, right? And the answer is not all of them. So if you think about, say, a self-emancipated slave, someone running to freedom, a fugitive slave, that might generate some paper in the form of a runaway slave notice in a newspaper, a jailer's notice, maybe a lawsuit if it got really extensive. But many of those relationships aren't going to generate paper, right? If you have two people running together, the conversations between them are not going to be recorded, right? If you have African Americans running through Southern Illinois asking for directions of how to get north, right? The person that gives them that aid, which is really important, right? Because if they say turn left at the next crossroads, and that actually leads them into Missouri, right? They're in a world of trouble. Right? If left actually leads them north, they may have a shot, right? So all of those relationships that are incredibly important don't create paper, right? So it's thinking about what of those relationships are going to create paper. And then the last level is what of that paper is going to survive and where is it going to survive, right? And my approach is then to think about how I get from that inner layer out to the sort of larger doll, and how I can begin to recreate some of those relationships, knowing just how fragmentary all of this is.
Yeah, you also do some really interesting work explaining how your sources change over time too. You know, like some of the sources available to you in the 1850s just didn't exist or didn't survive from the earlier periods. You know, can you talk a little bit about the differences of your sources from the earlier part of your study to what is available to you in the latter part of your study and kind of what that enabled or what challenges that presented to you?
Sure. So in the early part of the study, I have baptismal records, right? I have some court records and notarial records, but the mainstay of it are imperial records, either the French colonial archives or what brought me to the Clements, the Gage papers, right? That for a number of years, the British claimed the Illinois country, and Thomas Gage relatively actively oversaw administration there. And so what I realized is going through sort of painstakingly through the Gage papers is that there are instances where local disputes get kicked up to the higher level, right? Where for a variety of reasons, imperial agents become very interested in what's happening at the local level of Illinois. And so here's an example of an enclosure in one of the Gage papers from 1767, where there's a dispute over an enslaved person, right? And this gets brought to Gage's attention for a variety of reasons that we don't need to get into. But what's so interesting about this source then is that it allows me to sort of take the micro and connect it to the macro very, very easily. But in so doing, it erases a lot of those local experiences, right? So for instance, any information about this enslaved person, right? Even names don't get reported, right? Because that doesn't matter. What matters to Gage is the dispute over the slave, not who this person is, who he's married to, what his children do, where he's from, right? So the very document that preserves this person and allows me to see him also erases and destroys so much of his history, right? And so there's just very complicated process of saying, this is how I know about some of these experiences, but it's also how I don't know about some of these experiences, right? So the sources in the opening part of the book allow me to sort of get to the large macro level imperial questions pretty easily. The sources in the second half of the book, though, allow me to get at a closer view at the sort of local struggles, because I have local government records, right? Just based on how the United States makes its government, we have county governments, right? And so there you have enslaved people, because government is so much closer, trying to recruit local legal officials and local legal processes to their benefits. So they go into court much more often, and that then preserves much more of their life story, right? So if you do get more of the individuals at that level, you have a harder time getting the macro level story, right? Because many of those local cases don't get kicked up to Washington, D.C. They made a whole level of government, so they don't have to deal with this, right? So I went back and forth about which one I liked better. But over time, I just realized these are just very, very different sources that offer very, very different opportunities for the stories I can tell. And that's why there is a sort of imbalance in the book, is it comes sort of very naturally out of the archive. And it's actually a conviction of mine that we have to be more okay with some of those imbalances if we want to tell these very unconventional stories.
Right. And I think it's in that moment of like showing people like the sources do shape like what story you can tell, and that they are so very different was really important for me, like reading your story and knowing what story you can tell. But that said, do you have a favorite source or story that you came across while doing your research and writing?
Yeah, so there's one that I found, which then also sort of leads into the sources I didn't find, and sort of what that might look like. So the source that I found that was just so powerful for me was a speech that John Jones gave in 1872. Now, John Jones, for those of you who don't know, was a prominent leader of the abolition movement in Chicago before the Civil War. He's an African-American man there on the cover of my book. Try and point, I don't know how that works. Anyways, at the bottom of the cover of my book, his wife Mary is right above him. And he was instrumental in the 1860s in repealing Illinois' black codes, and he would go on to become the first black elected official in Chicago. And he gave this speech in 1872 to sort of mark the 10-year anniversary of the Emancipation Proclamation, right, which was issued in September of 62 to go into effect in January of 63. And he says, the great struggle for African Americans right now is to prove that we have a history, right? That it does not matter how great our people are, so our enemies say. It does not matter how great of an accomplishments we have, so our enemies say. If they do not have a history, right? If they do not belong in the American story, they're not really Americans, right? So it's a speech in the tumult of Reconstruction about the power of African-American citizenship, of African-American belonging, and the role history has in making that, right? And so as I was sitting here researching this history that I didn't know, it really struck me that a man at the time thought knowing this history was so important. But as much as I loved finding that, and I did, it also pointed to what was missing in the archive, which is a lot of records from Chicago, right? In the 1870s, there was a great fire and paper burns. And so many of the records that I would have liked to have had from the pre-Civil War era in Chicago simply aren't there, are very partial, are very thin, right? And at first, this really bothered me. I mean, this really, I thought, was a huge problem. But then I realized it was a great opportunity because it allows me to tell a history of African-American freedom politics in Southern Illinois, in rural Illinois, right? I think too often our studies of slavery and particularly of the abolition movement are an urban story. Boston, Philadelphia, New York, Baltimore. Instead, we have to take seriously that African-Americans everywhere had a freedom politics, right? African-Americans everywhere contested slavery, subordination, and white supremacy in the ways they could. And so because I didn't or couldn't tell the Chicago story as richly as I wanted to, it allowed me to focus the story on rural African-Americans in Southern Illinois who really pushed forward the cause of emancipation. And so in some ways that gap opened up a story that I just wouldn't have told otherwise.
It's just wonderful to be in conversation with you and kind of hear that interplay between, you know, how you access the sources and the stories that you tell and the frameworks that you use to kind of bring that story to life and the relevancy of it. I want to be mindful of time because I know people are going to have a lot of questions. I mean, I could talk to you all day because this is just fabulous and wonderful. But maybe just kind of to close this off, I'm really curious about what you're working on now, what we can expect to see from you, and if you want to talk a little bit about the lessons you learned from writing this book and maybe how that's shaping how you approach your next one.
Sure. So I'll take those in reverse order. One of the lessons that I learned from this book that's shaping the next one is just how to work with the different sources differently. And that if I had this to do it over again, I think what I might do in the opening chapters is fictionalize a bit more, right? I'd tell the reader, of course, and I'd create composites, right? I would take individuals who I had a little snippet of, and I'd stitch them together to sort of create a whole character, right? Again, with this all explained in the notes, right? Scholars of slavery and freedom have done that many times to great success. I mean, I'm thinking of Tara Hunter's work on Atlanta, because there is that sort of imbalance where there aren't the stories in the opening period. And I think, and it has just turned a lot of readers off, quite honestly. You know, one of my good friends advised, you know, begin the book at chapter 3, which is where it gets interesting. I don't recommend that to people, but, you know, I understand where that comes from, right? And so I think that's something that I would do differently, is just have a little bit more confidence to tell the story that I think is there, even if I can't always prove it is there. What I'm working on now builds off of this project. So the final chapter looks at kidnapping in Southern Illinois, well, in all of Illinois, but Southern Illinois in particular, as African Americans are taken out of the free states and into the deep South, right? And so the current project looks at some of those dynamics, but internationally. So there are any number of people, I'm still quantifying, but comfortably in the thousands, of people kidnapped from Philadelphia to San Domingue, from Jamaica to Cuba, from Barbados to Texas, right? A kidnapping that crosses an international line. And in some ways, this is going to complement the emerging literature on kidnapping that's out there, which is taking off and doing really great work. But in other ways, I want to tell a very different story about the freedom struggle internationally, right? And to just make the point that I sort of made earlier, that African Americans contested slavery and had freedom politics everywhere, Chicago versus Southern Illinois, but also if they were in Havana, right? And so that's the sort of struggle of freedom from abroad story is part of what I'm working on right now.
I can't wait to read it. I think that's amazing and wonderful. And your first book shows just how powerful of a writer you are. So I'm looking forward to reading that when it comes out. I'm going to pass this back to Angela because I'm sure I want to make sure there's lots of time for folks in the audience to also kind of pick your brain a little bit and ask their questions.
All right, great. Thank you so much. This has been really a great discussion. And I want to remind people of a couple of things. I'm going to give just a couple of housekeeping announcements before we go into the Q&A period. So as you're thinking of your questions, please type them into the Q&A section. And while I'm talking, Jane, you might want to look at Betty Bishop's question. And Cheney, if you are on, it would be great if you would look at that question as well and maybe type an answer in. So for announcements, we will take a holiday on July 3rd. There will be no Bookworm. But then we return on July 10th with The Social Life of Maps, with Mary Pedley hosting Martin Bruckner for a discussion about that book. And on July 17th, we'll have a collector's corner where Jack Dio will share his wonderful photography collection. And on the 24th, we'll be talking about business and labor history, welcoming author Brian Lusky to talk about his book, Min is Cheap, in conversation with Dyke Benjamin and Paul Erickson. So if you're new to the Bookworm, you might not know, but you are now signed up if you would like to be for future episodes. So you will receive reminders about those episodes. And if you're unable to join us live, you'll receive an email afterwards with a copy of the recording and any resources that we discuss. So later today, you'll receive that email. Since we won't be meeting next week, I want to share with you a couple of items from the Clements Library related to the 4th of July holiday. First, this is from our image bank. It's the signers of the Declaration of Independence and engraving by W. Wellstud. And the Clements Library, of course, is rich in many resources from this time period. So we would also like to share with you this amazing document that comes from one of our newly digitized manuscript collections, the Rochester Ladies Anti-Slavery Society Papers. This manuscript broadside advertised a festival on July 5th of 1852, featuring a reading of the Declaration of Independence and a speech by Frederick Douglass at Corinthian Hall in Rochester, New York. Douglass's oration praised the greatness and bravery of the Founding Fathers before eloquently illuminating the anniversary as a deceitful mockery in the face of American slavery. This speech, now better known as What to the Slave is the 4th of July, is widely considered to be one of the highest points of 19th century American oratory. This collection just became the first at the Clements to not only be fully digitized, but also fully transcribed and text searchable. So in the chat and in our follow-up email, we'll provide links to this broadside and the full text of Douglass's famous speech. All right, so thank you once again for being here with us. And as always, we really appreciate the camaraderie and the opportunity during this time of social distancing in getting together with all of you. If you enjoy the Bookworm and would like to make a gift, we'll also include a link in the chat section for that as well. All right, let's get back to, our questions. I saw in the chat that we had a question from Molly asking what advice you would give to historians who are working on their first book.
I think there's two things that are really important or have been really important to me. One is to make sure it's a topic that you really believe is fundamentally important, right? There are great books out there that I can't write because they're not the questions I ask. And so to make sure that, every day you want to get out of bed because you believe this book will really change the world if it's out there. That sort of conviction is important over the many years that it takes to write a book and the many no's that you're going to hear along the way, right? I think the second thing that you need to do, and it's connected to this, is to make sure you're asking really live research questions, right? To make sure you're asking questions that you don't yet have the answers to, and you need the help of people like at the Clements or at the Newberry or whatever your repository is to figure that out, right? Because that way, when you're in the archives and you're sort of moving through the sources, you're reading them to figure out where you need to go next, right? And it allows the sort of sources to shape the story rather than the other way around, right? I mean, one of the problems that I had at a certain point in time in this project was, a box of documents would come out onto the table and I would look at them and I would sort of say, well, I don't know if I need these or not. Like, I don't do I copy? What do I do with this, right? And that's not because I didn't know enough history or I'm not smart enough or whatever. It's because I didn't have the right research questions shaped in the right way that allowed me to figure that out, right? And so I think so long as you have questions that you are convinced are going to be really revolutionary, and questions that are active and live and allow you to sort of move organically through various different repositories and various different intellectual and academic communities, I think that's what's going to give you the best chance of coming out the other side. That's what I did anyway.
Great, thank you. Elizabeth is asking, she says she grew up in Chicagoland, and you touched on this a little bit, but she's mentioning that it's a very different place from downstate Illinois, and wondering about slavery in Chicago.
Sure. So there absolutely was slavery in early Chicago. Recall Chicago's incorporated as a city in 1837, right? So a century after where my book begins, right? So it's actually relatively late in the story. Chicago doesn't have an anti-slavery newspaper or a sort of important anti-slavery society until the late 1830s, 1840s, right? Compare that with Philadelphia, where their anti-slavery society is founded in the late 18th century. So Chicago, as we think about it today, is very different than downstate, but that change happens much later than we might recognize. So John Kinsey, one of the founding merchants of Chicago, owned slaves, and we have a bill of sale of Kinsey selling individuals. Into the 1840s, because the Illinois Black Codes were on the books, any African American without freedom papers, right, without the right types of registries, was subject to re-enslavement. And this happened in the 1840s. There were individuals who got in disputes with their employers called out the local officials, and these people were sold at public auction. Their labor, technically, was sold at public auction in Chicago in the 1840s. Now, that story plays out a little bit differently because the community in Chicago wasn't going to stand for this, and so no one bid on this man's indentureship and bought it for next to nothing and then freed him immediately, right? So this individual ended up all right on the other side. But there absolutely was a history of enslavement in Chicago before the Civil War.
Thank you. Dyke Benjamin is wondering if you ran across any indication that the individuals, such as the referenced judge, believe that the notion of slavery could be moral and ethical.
Could be if they were sort of pro-slavery thinkers.
And,
yeah.
And if there was any indication of their thoughts on that. Mm-hmm.
So frustratingly, I don't get that sort of thinking, right? Or that sort of discourse, right? That when slavery was sort of being actively, publicly debated in Illinois, it was usually around the 18-teens and 1820s. And there's very little pro-slavery thinking anywhere in the United States, right? Many people still thought of slavery as a sort of necessary evil, right? The rise of pro-slavery thinking actually comes about in the 1820s and 1830s. So it's not surprising from the time that I have the documents that I'm not seeing that. But in fact, what they end up saying, or the arguments they most often use, is whether this is good or bad or moral or not, it is legal, right? Because of the complicated multi-imperial histories that I talk about, these people should be exempted from emancipation, sort of grandfathered into the state, right? And because that turns out to be a winning argument, you don't get the same level of sort of ideological or sort of intellectual history of slavery from those individuals, right? ultimately, into the 1850s, 40s and 50s, when you get the rise of the Republican Party, and you get the rise of people that are theorizing a critique of slavery that's ultimately going to be incredibly powerful. They are advancing that, but their opponents tend not to rely on pro-slavery thought, right? They tend to rely on, again, these sort of complicated legal arguments. So no, I don't have sort of really vibrant pro-slavery thinking from Southern Illinois, but that's not surprising just given the times and places that I have sources for, right? It doesn't mean it isn't there.
Great, thank you. Martha is asking, with the kidnapping of Native Americans that you included, might you in the future look at the questions of slavery in Southern Illinois, in Iowa, where Julien Dubuque, a French-Canadian fur trader, tricked and in other ways treated Native people very badly?
Yeah, I mean, so this isn't a project that I'm going to take on, but back to Jane's question earlier, none of this is particularly unique, right? The Trans-Mississippi West is calling out for a study just like this, as is Indiana, right? There's some good work on Ohio, actually, but there's all sorts of places in the heart of North America that are gonna have histories similar, but also different from Southern Illinois. So this isn't my project, my next project, but it's critical work. And it points to just how we can't contain slavery, right? There's no one time or place where slavery existed. It was a ubiquitous set of experiences in US history.
Thank you. I just wanted to make a note because I already mentioned it out loud that Betty Bishop was asking about the Israel Shreve journals because his brother, Samuel Shreve, is one of her ancestors. Oh, and wow. She didn't know that we had the journal. So I thought that was pretty exciting. It's always fun to see what a small world it is and those kinds of connections that can be made. So if anyone else has questions, we can stay on for a couple more minutes. Go ahead and stick them in the Q&A section. Jane, did you have anything else that you were hoping to ask? Or Scott, do you have something you want to say?
I do, but Jane, go ahead.
Oh no, I'm just enjoying hearing you. If there's anything you want to add, please do.
Yeah, I do. I just want to say, because we began on the topic of acknowledgements, we might end on the topic of acknowledgements, because my mother is logged in today. She's in the acknowledgements of my book, of course, but she was a high school history teacher for 37 years. University of Michigan alum, class of 19, none of your business. And, you know, she was really an inspiration for me and incredibly supportive as I went through all of these processes. I sort of joked that in graduate school from time and again, I needed a Heerman family fellowship in order to stay a day longer at an archive, that sort of thing. So just, hi Mom, I made it. Thank you.
Oh, that is perfect. Thank you, Scott. That is indeed the perfect way to wrap up. And it's been a real pleasure having you here today. And thank you so much. And thanks, Jane, for leading the conversation.
Happy to.
All right. Oh, sorry. Wait, one more. Would you kindly, the name of the book that you were talking about in the beginning covers life from birth through death.
Oh, yes. Love and Toil.
All right.
By Ross, R-O-S-S.
Perfect. Okay. So on that note, many, many thanks. And thanks everybody for joining us today. Goodbye. Have a great weekend.